April 1945. A German prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg, Bavaria. The morning sun hits the barbed wire and the mud, but it offers no warmth to the men standing in the yard. 300 American soldiers stand in ragged lines, their skin stretched tight over bone, their eyes hollowed by months of slow starvation. They look like ghosts in olive drab. Across from them stands the camp commandant. He wears a gray uniform, pressed and sharp, without a single wrinkle. He holds a leather-bound logbook in his gloved hands. He looks at the approaching American tanks and then at his records. He insists that everything was done by the book. He claims his prisoners were fed according to international law. But the skeletal men in the yard tell a different story. George Patton is coming, and he is bringing a brand of justice that no logbook can hide. This is the story of what happened when a camp commander starved 300 Americans and called it compliance. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history. Each video dives deep into the true accounts of leaders who refused to look away when the rules of war were broken. First Lieutenant Daniel Crosby was 25 years old. He came from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He served with the 106th Infantry Division, a unit that had been slammed by the German winter offensive just months prior. Before the war, Daniel had been a clerk in a local hardware store, a man who valued precision and honest accounting. He enlisted because he believed in the simple difference between right and wrong. He had survived the freezing foxholes of the Ardennes only to be marched into the heart of Germany as a prisoner. In the camp, his body began to fail him as the skin pulled tight against his ribs, but his mind remained sharp. He carried a heavy burden of personal cost, having watched his best friend succumb to dysentery just 2 weeks before the liberation. Every night, Daniel risked his life to record the truth. He used a stolen pencil and scraps of paper hidden in the lining of his wool coat to document the slow murder of his men. He was the silent witness to every stolen meal and every lie told by his captors. Oberstleutnant Werner Falke was 49 years old. He was a career officer in the Wehrmacht, who had been assigned to the POW administration after a minor wound on the Eastern Front. Falke was a man of cold, aristocratic breeding from the outskirts of Dresden. He viewed the prisoners not as soldiers, but as a logistical burden to be managed and exploited. He often told his subordinates that the German soldier was the priority, and that a starving enemy was an enemy who could not revolt. Falke lived a life of unearned privilege in the middle of a dying Reich. While the men in the barracks were reduced to eating grass and turnip water, Falke wore a custom-tailored uniform that was always brushed clean of dust. He sat in a heated office with a silver tea service and smoked fine American cigarettes. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting a world of order that he had built on a foundation of systematic theft and calculated cruelty. By April 1945, the Third Reich was a shattered glass bottle. The Allied armies were pouring across the Rhine, shredding the German defense lines and driving deep into the heart of Bavaria. The German supply system had completely disintegrated under the weight of constant aerial bombardment and the rapid collapse of the national rail network. Food was scarce for everyone, but for the prisoners of war held in the path of the retreating Wehrmacht, the situation had turned from desperate to lethal. Across Germany, thousands of Allied soldiers were being marched eastward or left behind in camps where the guards themselves were beginning to run low on rations. In this atmosphere of total collapse, many German camp commanders claimed their hands were tied by the chaos of war. They pointed to the rubble of the factories and the craters in the roads as an excuse for the hollowed-out faces of the men under their watch. Many Allied officers, focused on the fast-moving front lines, often accepted these explanations as the unfortunate byproduct of a dying regime. They saw the lack of logistics as a universal tragedy rather than a deliberate crime. There was a prevailing sense among the high command that the mistreatment was a systemic failure of a defeated nation, rather than a personal choice made by the men in charge of the gates. However, the reality behind the barbed wire was often far more sinister than a simple lack of bread. While some commanders struggled to find scraps for their prisoners, others saw the administrative vacuum as an opportunity to enrich themselves and their loyal staff at the expense of human life. They relied on the fog of war to mask their corruption, believing that if they kept their paperwork in order, No one would look too closely at the empty bellies of the men in the barracks. They gambled on the idea that a well-maintained logbook could outlast the testimony of a starving soldier. The stage was set for a confrontation that would strip away the facade of bureaucratic compliance. Captain James Miller from the 4th Armored Division walked into the commandant's office and felt the sudden, sickening heat of a coal stove. He looked at the man behind the desk and then back out the window at the skeletal figures in the yard. He held a manifest in his hand that didn't match the graveyard he had just walked through. Captain Miller asked if the commandant realized his men were dying of hunger. Falke did not look up from his desk immediately. He finished signing a document before stating that the prisoners were fed according to the standing regulations of the German High Command. Miller countered that he had seen the bodies and that 30 pounds of weight loss was not a regulation. Falke adjusted his high collar and said that the Allied bombing of German supply lines was the only cause of the shortage. Miller stepped closer and noted that the German guards looked well-fed and healthy. Falke replied that a soldier of the Reich requires strength to maintain order over such a large population. Miller asked to see the Red Cross parcel distribution logs. Falke opened a heavy ledger and pointed to a series of meticulous entries. He said that every parcel received was accounted for and distributed to the detainees on schedule. Miller asked why the prisoners claimed they hadn't seen a chocolate bar or a tin of meat in 4 months. Falke smiled thinly and said that prisoners often lie to gain sympathy from their liberators. Miller pointed out that a man does not lie with his ribs. Falke stood up and said his rank entitled him to a certain level of professional courtesy from an occupying officer. Miller looked at the polished silver tray on the sideboard and told the commandant that his courtesy ended where the mass graves began. Falke snapped that he had followed the Geneva Convention to the letter, and that his logbook was the only evidence that mattered in a court of law. Miller realized the man felt completely insulated by his own paperwork. He turned on his heel and told his sergeant to secure the perimeter and touch nothing. He said this was no longer a matter for a captain. The report reached Patton within the hour. The roar of a multi-tone horn cut through the tension of the camp yard as a mud-splattered jeep skidded to a halt in front of the command post. General George Patton stepped out before the wheels had even stopped turning. He stood there in his high-polished boots, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the pale Bavarian sun, and 4 silver stars shining from the front of his helmet. He didn't say a word as he looked past the guards and straight at the huddle of skeletal men who were trying to stand at attention. The air seemed to grow colder as he walked toward Falke. His presence was a physical weight that pressed down on everyone in the square. He was not shouting, but the silence he brought with him was more terrifying than any roar. Patton stopped 3 feet from the German officer and looked him up and down like he was examining a piece of spoiled meat. He asked Falke if he was the man responsible for the records of this facility. Falke snapped his heels together and said that he was the commandant and that his logs were perfectly maintained. Patton asked if the men in the yard were the same men listed in those logs as receiving full rations. Falke replied that they were, but claimed their appearance was due to constitutional weakness and the lack of German supplies. Patton reached out and flicked the gold braid on Falke's shoulder, asking how a man manages to keep a uniform so clean and a belly so full while his charges are dying of soup made from dirt. Falke straightened his back and said he was an officer of the Wehrmacht and expected to be treated with the dignity of his rank. Patton leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He told Falke that he had seen many things in this war, but a man who hides behind a ledger while he murders his guests was a special kind of coward. He said that Falke had spoken a great deal about compliance and the Geneva Convention, yet his own quarters were filled with the very lifeblood he had drained from these Americans. Patton pointed to the crates of Red Cross chocolate and cigarettes being hauled out of the commandant's office by 2 burly MPs. He noted that while Falke sat in comfort, men like Lieutenant Crosby were forced to become ghosts just to keep the truth alive on scraps of paper. "You think your paperwork is a shield," Patton said, "but I find it to be a confession. You had a choice to be a soldier or a thief, and you chose to steal the breath from men who could no longer fight back. You have fed these men lies for 4 months while you gorged on their inheritance. Now, the ledger must be balanced. You will stay in this chair, and you will look at every man you tried to erase. You will experience the reality of your own logs. You can either sit and face the justice of the men you starved, or you can find out how quickly my MPs can settle a debt. Decide now, because my patience is thinner than the soup you served." Falk looked at the revolvers, then at the wall of hollow-eyed soldiers, and sat down in the mud. Patton signaled to his men with a sharp flick of his wrist. 2 MPs stepped forward and forced Falke into a wooden chair in the center of the muddy yard. A small folding table was placed directly in front of him. One by one, the stolen Red Cross parcels were brought out. The rich chocolate, the canned beef, and the white flour biscuits that Falke had intended for his own table. The smell of real food drifted through the air for the first time in months. But this food was not for the commandant. Patton ordered the American prisoners to step forward. He watched as the skeletal men, led by Lieutenant Crosby, were handed the rations that were rightfully theirs. They ate with trembling hands, the taste of home finally breaking the long nightmare of the camp. Then, a cook brought out a single tin bowl. It contained a gray, watery liquid with a few chunks of woody turnip floating at the bottom. The exact ration Falk had recorded as adequate. Patton looked at the bowl and then at the German officer. He ordered Falke to eat. The commandant hesitated, looking at the thin, bitter broth. The MPs moved closer. Falke took a spoonful, his face contorting in disgust as he swallowed the same filth he had forced upon 300 men. He ate under the silent, burning gaze of the soldiers he had tried to kill with a pen. Every swallow was a public admission of his own cruelty. When the bowl was empty, Patton stepped back. He told Falke that since he loved his logbook so much, he would have plenty of time to explain it to the War Crimes Commission. The prisoners watched in a heavy, satisfied silence as Falke was marched toward a waiting cage, his polished boots finally caked in the Bavarian mud. Daniel Crosby returned to Milwaukee and spent the rest of his life making sure that no one ever went hungry in his neighborhood. He worked as a manager at the same hardware store for 30 years, but his true legacy was the local food pantry he founded in 1952. He rarely spoke about the camp, but his family noticed he could never bring himself to throw away even a single scrap of bread. He kept his secret diary in a locked wooden box until his death in 1988, at which point his grandchildren donated it to a museum so the names of the 12 men who died would never be forgotten. Werner Falke did not fare as well in the world he helped to destroy. He was convicted of war crimes in late 1946, with the meticulous entries in his own logbook serving as the primary evidence against him when compared to Crosby's diary. He served 12 years in a military prison before being released into a Germany that no longer recognized his titles or his pedigree. He lived out his remaining years in a small apartment in Essen, working as a lowly night watchman for a textile factory. He died in 1974, bitter and alone, still insisting to anyone who would listen that he was merely a victim of administrative chaos and Allied aggression. General Patton never included the incident in his official memoirs, but he did recount the story in a private letter to his wife, Beatrice, written just weeks before his own death. He wrote that while he had seen many men kill with bullets, there was a special darkness in a man who killed with a fountain pen and a smile. He noted that the most satisfying meal he ever witnessed was not a state dinner or a victory banquet, but the sight of 300 starving soldiers eating chocolate while their tormentor choked on turnip water. He believed that some debts could only be settled by forcing a man to live the lie he had created. Some historians argue that Patton's brand of justice was unnecessarily theatrical, suggesting that he bypassed standard military procedure to humiliate a defeated officer for the sake of a public spectacle. They believe that even in the face of such clear atrocities, the dignity of the uniform should have been maintained through a quiet arrest and a formal handover to the legal authorities. Others argue that Patton's actions were the only appropriate response to a man who had used bureaucracy as a weapon of mass murder. They contend that by forcing Falke to experience the physical reality of his own lies, Patton provided the survivors with a psychological restoration that a courtroom never could. What is certain is that the physical evidence of the stolen Red Cross parcels and the detailed accounts in Daniel Crosby's diary created an unbreakable case that set a precedent for prosecuting administrative cruelty in the post-war trials. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply let the legal system take its course from the start? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe.